Hello and welcome to the European Report. Here we are again in the European Parliament here in Brussels, and this is the first programme of the new year, which is going to be a special programme as we discuss the Holocaust and its aftermath to mark the International Holocaust Memorial Day. I'm joined by Thomas Sandel, sponsor and supporter of the European Report of the European Coalition for Israel, a regular on the European Report, Hannu Takala, and a good friend of mine, Charlotte Gutman, who's a PR specialist and also the Vice President of the Jewish community here in Belgium. Hannu, I'll start with you. Hopefully you had a nice Christmas and a break, and this is a very important year for you as it's the election year. What does 2014 mean for you, and what do you have to do to prepare yourselves for the elections in a few months' time?
Yeah, it's a very important year, and first we have some busy months here in the Parliament to complete all parliamentary work by the end of the electoral term. And then comes the challenge of winning the elections and gaining the mandate to continue my work as a member of the European Parliament. And then also, when I think about the elections, the big challenge is to get people to cast their votes. And this is the only way that the people can impact European policy. So
for some of the viewers watching who should vote but don't vote, why is it so important they go out and actually vote?
That's the only way to influence. And I think that if here in the Parliament, for example, more Christian people, and if there is some friends of Israel, it's very important, because we live in that kind of time that we really need that kind of persons, that kind of people, and that's what I think. That's the only way to influence. If you don't vote, then you don't influence. Then might be some right wings and some populists or whatever going to take those seats.
Yeah, so it's important that we get you re-elected, isn't it?
That's what I hope.
And Thomas, I trust you had a good Christmas and a good break. So can you share with us some of the activities that ECI have got in store for 2014?
Well, I hope you have the whole program dedicated for that issue. Let me mention three, perhaps. In January, a lot will focus on our campaign Learn from History, which deals with this issue of the rise of anti-Semitism, commemorating the victims of the Holocaust. And there will be events here in Brussels, in the European Parliament. There are events in Berlin, in London, in Helsinki and elsewhere. And this has always been one of the most central messages of ECI, and we will continue with this message, hopefully also in the next 10 years with your help. Two other things, perhaps. There is still this issue of the disputed territories, where the EU in the last few months have been very active in putting into question the Jewish claim to those territories. And we would say that it's important that these issues should be negotiated first and foremost. They cannot be influenced by boycotts, by trying to predetermine the borders of a Palestinian or possible future Palestinian states. There is only one way to proceed, and that is through accepting international law, accepting the Oslo Accords, and negotiating. And we will, next month in February, we're hoping to meet with Catherine Ashton, the EU High Representative for Foreign Policy, and hand over our open letter on this issue, which is now signed by more than 40 members of parliaments and governments from across Europe. One is sitting here on my left-hand side. And thirdly, perhaps, and obviously this year is election year, and we believe, as Hannu said, it's so important that we go out and make use of our right to vote. If we don't do it, others will. And usually what happens in European elections is that for domestic reasons, the populists, the radicals, are those who are making use of this possibility just to protest, not necessarily having a vision of what they want with European cooperation, but basically voting in opposition to something. And what we are really fearing at this point is when we see this rise of anti-Semitism, both on the extreme right and the extreme left, if we don't get ourselves involved, I'm afraid the next European Parliament will look very different and will be a very hostile parliament to the Jewish people.
Which brings me into Charlotte Gutman, who's a PR specialist and chairwoman of ORT, and you're also the vice president of the Jewish community in Belgium. Charlotte, would you like to describe a little bit more about what ORT does and some of the activities that you've been involved in on behalf of the Jewish community in Israel over the last few months?
Thank you for inviting me, Simon.
Pleasure.
It's really a pleasure. And yes, okay, ORT Belgium is a little part of International ORT, which is an NGO that was founded in 1880 in St. Petersburg. In the meantime and up to date, it became a very, very important educational network of high schools and also still technical professional schools, vocational training. And so I'm very proud to represent them in Belgium. So what we do, because we don't have any schools anymore here in Belgium, there used to be 3 schools helping survivors of the Shoah after the Second World War to be trained and quickly get a job and become independent and become active in the society. And so this is the goal of ORT, this is the mission of ORT, help Jewish people around the world wherever they are in need. But it is today a non-sectarian organization, and we are organizing trips around the world to visit the ORT schools. We went to Strasbourg, we went to Vilnius in Lithuania, and now we are preparing a trip to South America, 2 high schools, very advanced scientific and computing technology, very advanced in these fields in Buenos Aires, and a university of more than 5,500 students in Montevideo, which we are going to visit as well. So I invite all the viewers who are interested to join the trip, please give me a call. So this is ORT. I was elected vice president of the Jewish community a few years ago. What do? We try to get friendly relations with politicians and press people in Belgium. And so we are issuing press releases regularly. We have a website, ccogb.be. We are on Facebook, and we organize a trip to Israel because we want to fight disinformation and caricature images about Israelis. And so we are witnessing what I call the cultural shock whenever people are coming to Israel for the first time. And I'm sure you're going to agree with me that they don't expect to see what they see because they have this background from European information, articles, and so it's very difficult for them to imagine that they are going to meet with normality.
That's a good line of defence there, I think, on defence of Israel. And Thomas, we're here really to discuss the International Holocaust Memorial Day, which is a special day put aside around the world to remember the horrific events that occurred during World War II with the destruction of over 6 million precious Jewish lives. Can you tell us why this day is so important, and that together with you and also with our friend here, Hanu, have made a memorial service here in the European Parliament, and why it's so important?
Well, I think it's historically should be obvious why it is important. I don't think that the European Union would exist today if it wasn't for the Holocaust. I don't think the United Nations would exist today if it wasn't for the nations coming together, learning something from the horrors of the Second World War and the Holocaust. So if we are to sustain these institutions, if we are to sustain our political culture in a way, we cannot forget what once happened. And it seems obvious when we state that, well, how could anyone forget? You know, we learn about it in schools, but sadly what we see today is a growing phenomena of members of parliaments denying the Holocaust, media personalities denying or trivializing the Holocaust. And with the spread of social media, where the historical context is always so thin, all the ingredients for a real rise of anti-Semitism is there. So this is why we need to be reminded time and time again of what did happen. I think we don't only need the facts, we also need an emotional attachment, really to sit down and be quiet and see it, say, in the form of a film, in the form of video clips which we have displayed on our website, and to see that this did really happen. These are people, the 6 million Jews who were slaughtered for one simple reason, that they were Jewish. And what I think is so important is to realize and to come to the conclusion that, as Primo Levi, the Italian author, once stated, it has happened and it can happen again. And sadly, when we look out in society, just over the last few weeks, we see again things that we thought would be could never happen in European societies. That there would be a rise of this quenelle, the Nazi salute gesture, which is spreading through media personalities, which is spreading through social media in a way that it's really scary, I think, personally.
I know this is why we need more programs like this to educate so many people about the dangers of anti-Semitism. And Hannu, you were very much behind, or one of the key members of the European Parliament here that initiated the Holocaust Memorial Service here in the European Parliament. How important is it that the European Parliament remembers the horrors of what happened over 69 years ago?
Yeah, as you mentioned, we started that some years ago, and I and Thomas this tradition, and in fact it's very important, and there is a strong link between the European Union and the Holocaust. When the Allied forces entered the concentration camp and saw the horror, the main thought was never again, and this created the desire to make sure that nothing like that would ever happen again in Europe. And we must remember that the EU was built on the ashes of the Holocaust, and the European Parliament is the right place to celebrate the Holocaust Remembrance Day, because it's our common responsibility to keep the memory alive. So I think that it's very important, and we are very happy about that we started that, but now it's the official day, and the Speaker of the Parliament take responsibility that it's going to organize that every year, so that's very important.
Yeah, and Charlotte, this is a particularly painful subject for you, I know, knowing that you are sorry, I'll just repeat that again. Yes, sorry, Charlotte, this is a bit painful for you, considering the subject matter of this issue and knowing that you are the daughter of a survivor. Can you share personally what this issue means for you and why it's so important that we keep this memory alive of those who perished at the hands of the Nazis 69 years ago?
Well, I would say first that I'm the daughter of two survivors. My father, on his side, was the only survivor from his family from Berlin. They were deported during the Fabrikaktion, which was a step in the Nazi strategy to deport the German Jews from their obligatory workplace. And these obligatory workplaces were not common because they were dangerous chemical environments like IG Farbe. And so on that day, the 27th February 1943, the German Jews were taken from their workplace. So they didn't know in the morning that they would not be able to get to their homes in the evening, like they were used to. Even they were wearing the yellow star on one part of the chest. And my grandfather, who obviously I didn't get to know because he was exterminated in Auschwitz, he wore on the left side of his chest the Iron Cross, which was given to him and his brothers in 1940, when the Nazis were already in place, as a recognition of the good services they gave during World War I. So it's very moving for me, obviously, to talk about this. And I would call it an administrative bug, but at the time there was no internet and no information technology. On my mother's side, she escaped with some members of the family from Kiev, and they were saved in Uzbekistan. And they left when the Nazis entered Russia. So the remaining family in Kiev was obviously exterminated in Babi Yar in 1942. So the impact on me, if you ask me, the impact on me is called the second generation syndrome. And having received most of non-verbal messages from my parents who were broken people, my late father, he was broken until his last day because he was stolen his youth and his family.
And how much does this still cast such a dark shadow over the Jewish community today?
Well, we are obviously trying to work on the memorial ceremonies, not to forget, because we are the daughters and the children and grandchildren of the survivors and who didn't make it and didn't survive, and some families disappeared totally from the map of humanity. And so we are trying to remember and remember and remember. So there are ceremonies remembering the Kristallnacht, 70th anniversary of Kristallnacht, and now we're getting into 70th anniversary maybe of Fabrikation in Berlin that was taking place, I think, already in Berlin in 2013. And yes, it's not to forget because we are habited by the Shoah, because obviously we grew up in families that were not complete. I had one grandparent on the four. I was lucky enough to have one. Many didn't even have one. And obviously what my parents transmitted to me, because they both suffered from starvation, I learned how food was sacred and could not be thrown away.
And Hannu, we have to also remember that the reason why the EU was established was because of the horrors of World War II, when the European nations, after the devastation caused by the Nazis, decided to get together to form a political union to preserve peace throughout Europe, and also thanks to great sacrifice by British and American troops in liberating Europe from the Nazis. Are we in danger of actually losing our freedom and liberty that was fought for so hardly during World War II, as today we're seeing a huge increase and rise of anti-Semitism?
Yeah, it is the real danger. And I would like to say that there are two issues. The rise of the anti-Semitism, but also the increase of xenophobia. All in all, attitudes have become harder. And I just would like to take one example. For the beginning of this year, it has been possible for the Romanians and Bulgarians to move to the other EU countries. It's alarming to see how negative reaction this has created. For example, especially in Britain also, you know, the headlines in the press have been quite xenophobic. And it is very important to maintain the European values and fight against all prejudice against other human beings. Anti-Semitism is increasing, but so is xenophobia, and we must to take a determined stand against both of these. And I really would like to underline that, because it might be first in the xenophobia, but then it goes to the racist and anti-Semitism, and you know, all that kind of hate speech. We have to be the zero tolerant for that.
Yeah. And Thomas, I mean, we're looking back now at 69 years since the liberation of Auschwitz death camp, in which the Russians found what the remains of, and very few survivors at Auschwitz. What lasting impact does that really have on Europe and the EU's responsibility to ensure not only peaceful relations between nations, but ensuring that we don't see a rise of hatred and a rise of anti-Semitism in our day?
Well, obviously, it is one of the fundamental and central roles of this Parliament and the institutions represented here in Europe. I think it's also important to say, in defense of the institution of the European Parliament, I think there are a number of very good initiatives going on. For example, this very week, when we are sitting here, they are installing an exhibition about Jan Kapinski, who was one of the most famous righteous Gentiles of the nations, who saved, or who actually in Poland was the person who managed to get to Roosevelt and to the British government to give a first-hand eyewitness report of what is happening in Poland. There are people like Raoul Wallenberg that we celebrated last year. In the UK, there is Sir Nicholas Winton. I know here in Brussels there will be a concert honoring the Consul of Bordeaux, who saved some 30,000 lives in France during the Vichy regime. So again, the very fact that there are people in this Parliament who believes that this is important, that they put up exhibitions, they organize seminars, I think it's a sign that there are many good people in this Parliament. That is not to say that there's not also a fair amount of negligence and a fair amount of double standards, especially when it comes to relating to the state, to the Jewish state, which was the outcome, if you wish, of the Second World War. And I think always when we see those double standards, as I mentioned earlier about the boycotts of Israeli goods, one should take a step back and say, well, how can it be that one of these never-agains that we committed ourselves to in 1945 are on the brink of being disrespected? So I think it's both. There are people like Hanno and others who's been on the program over the last few months who are really champions of these values, these European values. But also there is a rise of Holocaust denial, even in this Parliament. And if we don't engage before these next European elections, chances are that things will get much worse.
Yeah. And Charlotte, what's the perspective of the Jewish community here in Belgium regarding the rise of anti-Semitism that we're seeing across Europe today?
Obviously, the Jewish community is very concerned. Some people have already left the country and other countries in Europe, and they're going to Israel or to Canada or to the US, but they're leaving. And so it's not the majority yet. But we have to be aware with our past and sad history that things could happen, maybe not the same way as in the past, but things could happen, and we have to be awake and have the suitcase ready. I smile, but it's a cynical smile, of course. So let me, if you agree, remember a feeling of my late father when the Second Intifada started. And when the rise of anti-Israeli atmosphere was very, very expanded in Europe.
Yeah. 2000, in the year 2000.
Well, it started in September 2000, yes. And I hear my father telling me that he felt the same anti-Semitic atmosphere as he felt it before the war in the 30s in Berlin. So it was very interesting for me to hear that, because he came with his feelings. He was a young boy in the 30s, was born in 25, and here he feels the same. And obviously the anti-Semitism turned out in the last years to an anti-Israeli campaign, and Israel became the Jew of nations. Yeah. This is the strategy, in fact.
Yeah, and Thomas, we're having a problem today with the rise of anti-Semitism, but it's not the same as it was during World War II with the Nazis, with the racial profiling of the Jewish people. Instead, today it's multifaceted, coming from the left, coming from the right, and Israel's very much tied into the rise of anti-Semitism. Can you explain the rise of anti-Semitism we're seeing today, and why it's so important that we combat it?
Well, it's interesting, Charlotte, that you mentioned September 2000 and the so-called Second Intifada. In September 2001, there was a conference which I believe was a game changer, the Durban Conference in South Africa, which was a UN conference against racism, but there was also an NGO, a similar NGO conference on the same topic. One of the famous US congressmen, Tom Lantos, also a Holocaust survivor, said when he came back from Durban, he said exactly the same thing as you mentioned. I've never witnessed anything like this after I left the concentration camp. So obviously something was changing around that time. This is also where for the first time the so-called BDS movement got started, boycott and divest, and I see the parallels today also, and as you rightly said, Jew hatred today doesn't come in the same format as it did 70 years ago. These small mustaches are not very popular, and people don't dress or use the same language necessarily as Adolf Hitler did. This is traditional anti-Semitism, and I think often when we do research and surveys on anti-Semitism, we focus mostly on this, shall we say, right-wing extremism. But today it's much more settled, it's much more sophisticated. The focus is on demonizing and isolating a whole state. So typically you would have people saying that, well, I have absolutely nothing against Jewish people. Some of my best friends are Jews, but their language and their view on the Jewish state, on Israel, would be very different from any other assessment of any other state in the world. So there are clear double standards. Let me just give one example, because we discussed in the last program the EU stance on the disputed territories, where they said this is a major problem. It was like nothing else matters in the whole Middle East, the fact that hundreds of thousands are dying in Syria, this was the major problem. And they said, well, this is violating international law because these territories are disputed, they're not Israeli. Interestingly, what happened exactly 1 month later was that the EU had a fishery trade agreement with Morocco. And as you know, in Western Sahara, it's also disputed territory. No nation in the world have acknowledged Moroccan sovereignty over South Sahara. But nevertheless, the EU came to the conclusion to say that while this might be true, Morocco still have, they're still controlling this part, so they have de facto sovereignty. Sorry, Western Sahara, I'm getting mixed up, it's not Southern, Western Sahara, yes. So Western Sahara would still belong to Morocco, and the trade agreement would also include Western Sahara. So again, a very similar case like with the disputed territories, but a completely different conclusion. So if you don't call this double standard, I don't know what is double standards.
Which leads me on to my next question, Hannu. On the one hand, the European Parliament here, the European institutions remember the Shoah or the Holocaust by having a memorial service and paying essentially lip service to anti-Semitism. But at the same time, we see this real marginalisation of Israel and almost hatred towards Israel coming out of the EU institutions. How can the two be aligned?
That's a very good question, and also a bit delicate question and issue. I think that we have to be careful how we analyze this issue. So within the Knesset, the opposition also criticized the Israeli government and its policy quite harshly. I've been many times in Knesset. I know the way how they talk there. Anyway, European Parliament members, they feel that they may criticize the policies of all countries, including Israel, when they are against their political ideas. It is important to make sure that the criticism of Israel is against its policy and not based on the anti-Semitist ideas. And it seems to me, unfortunately, that there are some who criticize Israel, but it's purely anti-Semitic, and that's what we have to be very, very careful. Of course, you can criticize some Israeli policies, but you have to be clear that it's nothing anti-Semitic. It's not include something anti-Semitic. And we should also keep in mind that there are political and economical reasons why many European politicians share Arab sympathies. One reason is oil. And it is important that we understand that there is any place for any anti-Semitic speech in the European Parliament. We have to keep our values and we have to be faithful for them.
Yeah.
Simon, if I could just come
go.
back to clarify, because I believe it's important, as Hannos just said as well, that we should not confuse criticism of the policies of the Israeli current or future governments with anti-Semitism. But there is a slippery slope where I think it's Nathan Sharansky who mentioned a number of criteria where he said when anti-Israelism will transform into anti-Semitism. One of them, of course, is proportions. Are we looking at Israel in the same way as we would look at any other of, say, the UN 193 member states? And what worries me, and that's why I brought up the BDS movement, is that you would be as extreme as saying, well, we can have nothing to do with the Israeli state. Let's boycott Israeli academics who invent all these chips that we put in our computers or come up with solutions to cancer and this and that. Let's boycott all of that. And I think that is a very grim reminder of the mood in Europe in the 1930s when we said, the first thing which was said before we saw even the first trains going to Auschwitz, that was Kauf nicht beim Juden, don't do business with Jews. How can it be that we still today use the same type of language, looking at what Jewish people have brought us in terms of Nobel prizes, inventions, and dynamic economy, and nevertheless our response is simply, boycott Israel. For me, that is very difficult to understand.
Absolutely. And Charlotte, this week, the Jerusalem Post commented on comments made by the Israeli Knesset speaker, Yuli Edelstein, who was questioned on the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, which reported that in France there's been a 21% increase in anti-Semitic instances where one or more Jew has actually reported an attack or verbal abuse, together with the fact that over 63% of the Jewish community in France has made aliyah towards Israel. And also he talks about, and other members of the Israeli Knesset have also warned that the rise of anti-Semitism that we're seeing in Europe could lead to violence. What's your take on this statement?
Well, first we have to look into the fact that the report on anti-Semitism is what it is, with statements and people who have done a declaration to the police or to Jewish organization dealing with anti-Semitism. We know by fact that this figure is low, is not corresponding to reality. And we don't know what is the proportion of non-declaration of anti-Semitic acts or verbal anti-Semitism. So I fear that there is a fear. People are afraid I think, to go and declare to the police. Might be that there was a fear. And sometimes I wonder if the fear didn't go up to the politicians' level and that they don't dare to make declarations and strong statements to defend Jewish communities in Europe. Because words can lead to violence. And we've seen it with Ilan Halimi, with Merat in Toulouse. And I think that today the freedom of expression has no limit and gets over to promotion of hate. And that's the real problem today, and there was a lot of talk about it, you mentioned it. Now to talk about Israelis, I think that what is harming them also is their dignity. You know, I don't hear this word mentioned when people talk about Israel, but the dignity of Israelis is being harmed in such a way that I don't see any other country, any other people in this world being attacked like Israelis are attacked. And for me, there is no reason. What did we do wrong? Why? What is the purpose of it? You know, for me, I am privileged because I was born after the Second World War. But I really wonder, what did we do? Why are we considered so bad? And this is just a campaign, you know. I'm also a PR and journalist in the background, and my mission in my life is to fight against disinformation and caricatures. And I wrote an article that is still on the website of Radio Télévision Belge today, so more than a year, about the strategy beyond the propaganda campaign against Israel and taking the Middle East conflict as a case study. And it's very, it touches me obviously very deeply. Although I'm surrounded by optimistic people in the Jewish community who think and are convinced that the democratic values will win over demonic purposes.
Yeah. And Hannu, in your opinion, as a leading member here of the European Parliament, what can the European Parliament do and other MEPs to confront this rise of anti-Semitism that we're seeing, where Jewish people are being targeted and we're seeing attacks? And how can we ensure that, as Charlotte was saying, that hate does not turn to violence?
I think that the first thing is that we must keep to emphasize the core European values: human dignity, human rights, freedom, express. And there's a parliamentary working group here in the European Parliament, group of the Anti-Semitism, which is quite active and quite active in confronting these issues. However, I believe that as much as Europeans assume the core values, there will be less anti-Semitism. And as you may know, that my background is a teacher, and I really believe the education. So I think that we also need to more emphasize on education in history. When young people understand what has happened, they will appreciate the European values more, and anti-Semitism and the other xenophobic attitudes will have less room to move. So I think that we have to invest in education and education in history, and some kind of peace education also, that people really know what is Europe about, and that's the one important way and important tool what we have to use at the moment in Europe.
And Thomas, the fact that we have Israeli leaders, Israeli members of the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli Parliament, actually coming out discussing about their concerns about the safety of the Jewish community in Europe, shouldn't that put more pressure on the European authorities, particularly the security and police forces, to ensure that they're confronting what we're seeing, this rise of violence against the Jewish communities?
Absolutely, and maybe it's important to emphasize here that this is primarily a responsibility of national governments or the member states. And I think there are some good developments on that front, but nevertheless, my understanding is, and correct me, Charlotte, if I'm wrong, In many of the member states, it's actually up to the Jewish communities themselves to defend themselves. And so often over the years when I've spoken about anti-Semitism in Europe, I mentioned the fact that, you know, wherever you go to a kindergarten, say in Brussels or another major European city, it seems like it would be the Pentagon, you know, just looking at the security measures around that little, you know, kindergarten. And you ask yourself, you know, is there something that I'm missing here? You know, what threat are these children posing to anyone, anywhere? And sadly, I know in some of the member states still the chunk of these costs is to be paid by the Jewish community themselves. And this, of course, cannot be accepted. So I think, you know, the first thing that should happen is that any measure of security that is needed on a member state level should be paid by that host government. We would never accept that any other community, certainly not my community, the Swedish speakers in Finland, would have to arrange privately for our security. But obviously, I think the European Parliament and the European institutions here in Brussels, they have more symbolic importance in raising these issues. And I think there's so much coordination that is taking place in Brussels anyway. So I clearly see a role for the European Parliament to raise this level on a European, raise these issues on a European level, because it's not only a Belgian problem, it's not a French problem, it's a pan-European problem, which is growing in particular countries. And maybe we should say as Finns that in Finland, but perhaps mostly because of a very small Jewish community, we don't see much of these problems there. But looking at, say, Hungary, Greece, parts of France, this country, Belgium, real problems, to the extent that people on the street would say that we fear for our safety. And as you mentioned, that the people considering, or people who have already left these EU member states is growing every day.
But isn't one of the problems we're facing, maybe the EU is not really properly addressing that, and this is the rise of anti-Semitism that's coming from the Muslim communities here, Muslim immigrants coming in from North Africa, the Middle East, who have been indoctrinated through imams and the education system, coming here to Europe and holding very strong anti-Semitic views. And surely there needs to be a greater educational program addressed to Muslim communities across Europe.
Yeah. I think that any legislations against hate speech, regardless of who is the person responsible for that, be it a Christian or a Muslim or an atheist or a communist or a fascist, should be implemented very clearly. I think, again, I'd like to give credit to the French government. They don't get much credit nowadays, so I'll be happy to give them some. The Interior Minister just made a statement only a few days ago to say again that this neo-Nazi gesture, the quenelle, again, cannot be understood as anything but incitement to hatred and anti-Semitism, and this should be covered under French legislations against incitement to hatred or hate speech. Yep. So I think that there are governments who are watching this carefully and are willing to use all their legislative means that there are to stop it. But I think it was Hannu who said it earlier. I think the only antidote is really education. You know, legislation can only take us this far, but we need education. We need peace education, and in particular in communities where most of the students don't have a European background, as you mentioned. They don't feel part of this European history and European tragedy. They need to be educated and taught about it. Also here, I'd like to mention the United Nations, who have an excellent program which is being spread throughout the world right now. And I met with their chief in New York just a few weeks ago, and she'd been to China. And she said that in China and in parts of of Africa and Asia, there's a real interest in learning about this experience, but also learning how, seeing what are the implications for their nations. Because anti-Semitism, of course, racism or xenophobia, be it in Rwanda or South Sudan right now, the lessons are always the same. It has to do with the human dignity. It has to do with tolerance and mutual respect. So we can all learn from the lessons, the tragic lessons here in Europe 70 years ago.
Yeah. And Charlotte, just reading a recent article published by the European Jewish Press, reports that how in the Netherlands the boycott, divestments and sanctions movement, the BDS, is using an image of Anne Frank, according to my notes here, dressed in a red kippah, to promote its political aims. And one of the BDS supporters on Twitter wrote, "Boycotts and sanctions against Israel are how we respond to war criminals who use the Holocaust to justify their crimes." It added, Gaza is full of Anne Franks. Gaza is the world's biggest concentration camp. What is your response?
My response is Goebbels. I really think that the anti-Israeli propaganda campaign, worldwide campaign, that is in place for more than 40 years, has as a goal to make the amalgam between our past, our sad past as Jewish people, and the current history of Palestinians. So what did Goebbels say? He said, the bigger the lie, the better it will be believed. And this is so untrue and so amazing and so foolish to say what you just referred to. I mean, I don't even want to repeat it because there are so many arguments to counteract this so easily. And I'm sure that the people, the viewers who are listening to this program are informed enough, I hope, that they will understand where is the limit of lie and where is the beginning of truth. And this is so difficult to prove today. And how can it be proved? I think I'm relying to you, I'm referring to you, I'm asking you, because I really believe that the European Parliament, European Commission, European Union have a great responsibility, as did Mr. Valls speak out in France, to speak out clearly and loudly against anti-Semitism. As long as the leaders of the countries in the world will not loudly speak against, I think we are going to face an impossible fight.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Thank you for your help.
Yeah, and I just, I've been many times in Gaza. Of course, it's a difficult situation, but inside the European Union, if you go to Oradea in the Romania, where some Roma village, the conditions are much worse. And it's something that inside the European Union, we have to do our homework first, and then we can go to point it and say something to Israel. And I think that, of course, what we can do and what we try to do in the European level, try to help the peace process. And that's what we ask. So Palestinians started the peace process and really try to develop those areas like Gaza and the West Bank and so on. But it seems to me that they don't have the will for that.
But Hamas is responsible for Gaza.
Right,
it's not Israel. It's not part of Israel.
Yeah, that's right. It's a terrorist organization, and we can't give any credits for the Hamas. It's a real awful what they have done there during the years.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like what you said, Charlotte, about political leaders speaking out, and the statement from the French Interior Minister is a good example. There are a few good examples here from the European Parliament, but sadly are never reported in media. So again, there's an imbalance of what the journalists are picking up and for what is important. I remember the first year that the current President Martin Schulz spoke at the Holocaust Memorial. You were there, both of you, I think, and he said, well, as a son of a German officer in the Second World War, my first and foremost, my most important job in this mission, in this parliament, will be to defend the Jewish people. And then he paused, and the state of Israel. That was never, ever reported anywhere. I made a big press release of it myself and put it on our website, but it has been awfully quiet. Last year, he also said something very good, where he said that, Holocaust denial will not be accepted in this parliament. And he said, as a president, if this is ever said publicly in this chamber, I will point to the door. So, but again, it's probably just us knowing about it. So it was never reported in the large newspapers. Yeah. But I think the European leaders, meaning the President of the European Parliament, the President of the European Council, Herman van Rompuy, the President of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso, they should speak out. They should speak out clearly. I think these next months will be so decisive now. Are we going to surrender to these new forces of intolerance and racism and anti-Semitism, or are we going to stand up? And there is no option but to take a stand.
Yeah. And sadly, we come to the last 5 minutes of the programme, so I think we need to really sum up. Charlotte, you're representing here the Jewish community of Belgium, and you're very concerned, and we all are, about the rise of anti-Semitism. But what role can Christians play in combating the rise of anti-Semitism we're seeing, sadly, in Europe in 2014?
And I think you're doing quite well, huh? I'm very impressed by your activities to give us the real recognition that we need, because it's so unfair and unjustified what's going on there. And you mentioned the press, the proportion of media coverage on Israel, negative coverage, of course, is so amazing compared with what's going on in so many other countries where things are much worse and not to be compared even. So I would say that I would like to remember that Israel is a democracy. It is a multicultural society. It is a fact. There is a multicultural coexistence of different cultures. And this is a fact of the Israeli society. I know it's difficult for some people to imagine that, but I would like to emphasize this. And I would also like, if you allow me, to emphasize that we are witnessing, as Jews, something terrible, because we are the people of the book, and we are the people of life. Saving lives, and I don't have to remember the field hospital in Haiti and on the Syrian borders. We are the people who want to save lives, and whatever Israelis are doing, they're doing it always to save a maximum of lives, even if it doesn't show in the articles. So this is our Judaism. We have to save life. This is our richness. This is our fortune. This is our aim in life, mission in life. Save lives, whatever, and from wherever they come and whoever they are.
Yeah. And Thomas, sorry, I'll go to you, Thomas. What is your response? Because clearly ECI is set up here to have a presence in the European Parliament and also in the EU. I mean, as Christians, when you look at the rise of anti-Semitism that we're seeing across Europe, it's reaching levels that are very similar to that of the 1930s and 40s. How can we mobilise more Christians and others to really get on side with this issue to confront anti-Semitism?
It's a good question that we've been pondering, of course, for years. We're doing what we can, and thank you, Charlotte, for the acknowledgement. I think this program, being one example, just raising these issues, make sure that everyone are aware of what is happening, but also this is our outstretched hand as European Coalition for Israel. We want to be your voice, your legs here in the European Parliament. Not everyone can be here. You know how difficult it is to get accreditation and to work on your reputation so that you can actually engage with the decision makers. But I think the nicest things that has ever been said about our organization is, it's been said a number of times. They said that the biggest difference between the 1930s and the day we are living in now is that in the 30s there were no coalition of Christians that would come together, being able to report, as Jan Kinski was able to go to Roosevelt and said, well, I have eyewitness reports what's happening in Poland. Of course, there was no social media at that time. It was much more difficult, but nevertheless, I think the Christian culture failed the Jewish people. And we can never accept that this could happen again. So I think the good news is that we have an infrastructure. We are accredited here, we come here every week, and we bring our message forth. But we need the help of the viewers of this program, of Christians across Europe, to pray and to support us any way they can, and also do the work themselves. And I always start to say pray. This is a spiritual battle in many ways, but also to educate, to make sure that they are educated and pass on correct information to their friends. And finally, what we say, advocacy, to be here, to speak up, to articulate this Christian voice in support for Israel.
I just want to thank you all for joining me on today's European Report. So thank you for the contributions on this special programme. And I want to thank you all for watching today's European Report as we remember the Holocaust and the Shoah that was responsible for the murder of over 6 million Jews at the Nazi death camps. And it's a lesson that we all need to learn, that anti-Semitism didn't die during the Second World War, but is still very much with us today. And that's why we need to muster all our strength and to counter what we're seeing is a rise of anti-Semitism across Europe, to make sure that this never happens again. So let's remember those precious 6 million Jewish lives who perished at the hands of the Nazis and make a stand against anti-Semitism.